Welcome back to Sip and Talk. Hope you've got something good to sip on. Grab a comfy seat.
Yeah, great to have you with us again. Sometimes the stories behind the headlines are where things get really interesting.
Totally agree. And speaking of headlines, today we're kind of peeling back the layers on two pretty hot topics.
We are.
First up, we're going to try and unpack the economic side of President Trump's tariff policies. That always gets people talking.
Oh, absolutely. And then we're shifting gears a bit to something else we've all heard a million times, right? That whole ongoing saga of fake news accusations.
Right. The ones President Trump often aims at, well, certain media outlets. It's definitely a phrase that sparks conversation.
It really does.
So our mission today, like always, is to try and cut through the noise, give you the clearest facts we can from an international angle, and really just encourage you to think for yourself.
Yeah, it's about getting those important bits without feeling totally swamped by everything flying around. Think of it as your shortcut to knowing what's going on.
Exactly. So let's kick off with the economy. President Trump, he hasn't been shy about his feelings towards the Federal Reserve, right? Calling the leadership terrible.
Oh, yeah. That's become almost like his signature line on that topic.
Yeah.
Very consistent criticism.
It has. And you'd think with all that strong talk, especially about tariffs, markets might get jumpy, maybe inflation goes up.
Right. That's the conventional wisdom.
But what's really fascinating is, despite that, the Treasury Deputy Secretary sounded surprisingly calm about inflation. Actually pointed out that May's inflation data after the tariffs were announced hit a 4-year low.
Which is kind of backward, right? A bit counterintuitive. And if you rewind to 2019, when he first put those tariffs on China, the U.S. didn't see inflation spiral.
No.
It was actually the opposite. Record low inflation, decent growth, good job numbers. Kind of makes you wonder, do tariffs always hit the way we expect? Or is something else going on?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I remember, thinking my grocery bill was going to go through the roof.
Yeah, me too.
But it looks like the Treasury's thinking, and maybe some past data supports this, is that tariffs might get absorbed mostly by the producers, like the foreign companies, not necessarily passed straight on to us.
Exactly. So maybe that new pair of shoes you bought or some electronics, the price didn't jump as much as you feared because the importer or the manufacturer ate some of that cost.
Right. They'd rather make a bit less profit than lose customers by jacking up prices too much.
Precisely. And looking forward, the Treasury actually thinks average tariff rates might decrease because countries, including the U.S. and China, seem more willing now to talk about lowering those non-tariff barriers.
Yeah, non-tariff barriers. Those are sneaky. They don't get the headlines, but they can be a huge deal, sometimes even bigger than the actual tariff percentage.
Definitely. For anyone listening, maybe not super familiar, what are we talking about there?
Good question. So non-tariff barriers aren't direct taxes. There are things like really complicated import license rules or quotas setting limits on how much stuff can come in.
Or like super strict health and safety standards that are tough for foreign companies to meet. Even just, bureaucratic red tape that slows everything down, adds cost without being called a tariff.
Right. So if countries are negotiating those down, that's actually a pretty big deal for trade, isn't it?
Huge. Even with China hitting back with its own tariffs, that's sort of tit for tat we saw.
Yeah.
The U.S. is still pushing for these bigger agreements. The hope is that overall tariffs might end up lower than what was announced back in April, especially if these other barriers fall.
It really shows how these big policy decisions, things that sound kind of distant, can actually, affect what you buy and how businesses operate globally.
It's all connected. Understanding that helps you see past just the shouting match sometimes.
Okay, speaking of global stuff, Trump's influence isn't just trade, right? It's really shaking up alliances. He claimed a pretty big victory at that NATO summit recently.
Yeah, that was significant. The reporting suggests he really pushed, and allies agreed, to raise defense spending. Not just raise it, but to hit, 5% of GDP, which is ambitious.
Super ambitious. And it's specific, too, right? It's not just a vague number.
Exactly. That's key. So 3.5% of that 5% has to go to actual military hardware ammo, artillery, tanks, the pointy end stuff.
Gotcha.
The other 1.5% is more flexible. Could be cybersecurity, border stuff, or even helping build up their own national defense industries. It's a massive change from how things used to be.
It really is. I saw that quote from the Finnish president.
Oh, that's perfect.
Saying, like, 3 years ago, if someone said Finland would join NATO and spend 5% of GDP on defense, he'd have told them they were crazy, basically.
Yeah. See a doctor, I think he said.
Okay.
It just highlights this huge shift in, well, European security thinking. More self-reliance could change things for decades.
But not everyone's jumping for joy about that 5% target. Spain, for instance, seems worried about hitting it.
Right. They've voiced concerns. And apparently, President Trump didn't mince words, threaten them with trade stuff, even talking about double plus tariffs if they don't step up.
Which gets complicated, though, because Spain's in the EU, right?
Exactly. The EU has its own trade policy for the whole bloc.
Yeah.
So targeting Spain directly with U.S. tariffs could, accidentally spark a bigger fight with all of Europe. It's not quite as simple as just picking on one country.
Good point. Okay, shifting slightly, market chatter. There's buzz that Trump might name the next Fed chair pretty soon, maybe as early as September.
Yeah, that's definitely got the financial world talking. If he does, it could make Jerome Powell, the current chair, a bit of a lame duck sooner than expected.
Yeah.
Creates uncertainty.
And the expectation, if there is a change, is for someone more.
Dovish.
That's the word on the street, dovish.
And for you listening, dovish just means generally someone less likely to raise interest rates, maybe even open to lowering them, right? Which tends to weaken the dollar good for exports and often helps the bond market. So yeah, lots of people watching that space very closely.
Okay. And sticking with presidential actions, there are talks coming up with Iran next week. But here's a twist. President Trump is saying pretty firmly that the strike last week completely destroyed their nuclear facilities.
Yeah, he's been very clear on that claim.
Yeah.
Which, if it's 100% accurate, maybe makes diplomacy seem less urgent from his perspective.
Right. But then we're also hearing other intelligence reports suggesting it was more of a setback for their program, not total destruction.
It's like getting two different versions of the same story, isn't it? Leaves you wondering which is closer to the truth. Though the U.S. is still saying they're optimistic about some kind of peace deal, despite these different takes on the strike.
Definitely makes the upcoming talks interesting, with those conflicting narratives floating around.
For sure.
Okay, let's switch to global markets for a sec, because there's one company just dominating headlines, NVIDIA. Its tech is probably in half the things you're using right now.
NVIDIA, yeah, their stock just went nuts. All-time high. Back to being the most valuable company in the world, $3.7 trillion? It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. If you follow tech or gaming or especially AI, NVIDIA's right there in the middle of it.
Totally.
And this huge success is mostly down to confidence in this global AI arms race, right? Everyone wants their chips.
Absolutely. Massive demand for their GPUs, their accelerators. All the big tech companies are pouring billions into AI.
Yeah.
And a huge chunk of NVIDIA's money, like 40% of their revenue, comes from those big AI spends. They're basically selling the picks and shovels for the AI gold rush.
Huh. Perfect analogy. Okay, so on the flip side of that global coin, President Trump's tariffs, they've put unprecedented pressure on Chinese manufacturing. That's a quote.
Yeah, it's definitely a major factor shaking up supply chains. We're seeing this real trend, manufacturers moving factories out of China.
Right, heading to places like Vietnam, other Southeast Asian countries, basically trying to dodge the tariffs. It's like this big global shuffle happening.
It is. And adding to that picture, China's own huge sovereign wealth fund, the CIC, it manages like $1.3 trillion they've been pulling back significantly on investments in the U.S.
Wow, that's not small change.
Not at all. It's a pretty big strategic move.
And it feels like a really strong symbol, maybe even a metaphor, for this whole decoupling idea between the U.S. and China, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about tariffs anymore. It's spilling over to the whole economy, into financial markets.
Yeah.
And this decoupling seems to be speeding up. We could see more separation, not just in trade and money, but in technology too, like different tech standards, maybe even separate internets down the line.
It feels like it could really reshape things, even for everyday products you buy, changing where they come from. A huge shift.
It's potentially seismic, yeah.
Okay, let's tackle the other big topic. Something President Trump basically made a household phrase, fake news.
Oh, yeah. That term is everywhere now. And he definitely has his favorite targets.
He does. Usually CNN, NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Those seem to be the main ones.
And the labels he uses are pretty strong, right? Fake news, obviously, but also enemy of the people. Very stark language.
Extremely. So why? Why these attacks? Well, one big reason seems to be when they report on stuff that's unfavorable to him or his administration.
Right. These outlets often dig into internal government stuff or report on investigations like the Russia probe or details about foreign policy actions.
And from his point of view, he sees that not as just journalism, but as biased, maybe even false attempts to undermine him, a direct attack on his narrative.
Yeah, that seems to be the perspective. Another thing he points to is like selective quoting or editing, taking things out of context.
Right. He might say they only reported on, say, a failed military strike without the strategic reason behind it, or they focus only on his critics and ignore supporters or any positive news. It's about the framing.
And then there's the political strategy angle, too. Can't ignore that.
Definitely. By attacking the mainstream media, he really shores up his base, doesn't he? Many of his supporters already distrust those outlets.
Yeah, they often see them as part of a biased establishment. So his criticism resonates, it rallies them, it works politically.
Okay, but the big question then, the one you probably ask yourself is, are they actually fake news?
Well, yeah, that's the core of it. And it's important to make distinctions. Outlets like CNN, which leans left, or MSNBC, more left, or Fox News on the right, they generally have journalistic standards. Fact-checking processes exist.
Right. They're mostly credible news sources, but, and this is key, they often present news through a particular political lens. There's bias there, for sure.
Absolutely. And where it gets confusing for people, I think, is that the line blurs between straight news reporting and, like, commentary or opinion shows.
Oh, yeah. Those opinion hosts can be really passionate, but it's not the same as a factual news report.
Yeah.
And sometimes they run back to back, making it hard to tell which is which. That definitely erodes trust.
And, look, even the best outlets mess up sometimes. We have to admit that. CNN had that WikiLeaks report error back in 2017, got a date wrong. The New York Times got criticized for relying heavily on anonymous sources early in the Russia stuff.
Right. And while those usually get corrected, when those mistakes happen, even if they're not deliberate fake news, they add up. They chip away at trust over time.
Definitely. So, given all that, why do so many people believe it's fake? Part of it is just political alignment.
Right.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah. If you lean conservative in the U.S., you might already distrust outlets perceived as liberal. You'll probably prefer Fox News or Breitbart or maybe Truth Social now. Sources that confirm your views.
Exactly. And that leads to this crazy split in where people get their news. It's like totally different information bubbles.
It really is. You might watch CNN all day. Your neighbor might only watch OAN. And you both end up thinking the other person is living in a fantasy land built on fake news. You can't even agree on basic facts sometimes.
It's that echo chamber effect, amplified by social media, which is another huge factor.
Huge. A lot of people seem to trust, like, random unverified videos or short clips they see online more than a reported news piece.
Yeah, because it feels unfiltered, maybe more real somehow. Even though there's often zero fact-checking behind it, that raw feel can be really persuasive.
Man, it is just Wild West out there for information. Trying to figure out what is tough. You had that funny analogy before.
Oh, the weather app one.
Yeah. Tell that one. It nails it.
Okay, so Trump calling NBC fake news is a bit like complaining the weather forecast lied because you wore a raincoat and didn't rain. The problem might not be the forecast. It might be your own broken weather app.
Huh. Yeah, that captures the perception versus reality thing perfectly.
It really makes you, the listener, think, right, how do you decide what's trustworthy? With so much information, so many different spins, how do we all get better at spotting the difference, between real reporting, biased opinion, and just plain old misinformation? That media literacy thing is critical now.
That is a great thought to end on. Wow, we covered a lot today. From global economics, trade wars.
Yeah, all the way to media, politics, NATO. Quite the mix.
It was a whirlwind. We really hope you found it useful, maybe gave you some things to think about.
Absolutely. Hope it was insightful.
And hey, if you enjoyed Sip&Talk, please hit that subscribe button wherever you listen. And quick shout out before we go. Our good friend Mickey.
Yes. Check out his YouTube channel, Mickytolife. Seriously, funny memes, great music taste, does wine tasting, travel vlogs. It's just fun.
So good. And word is he's gearing up for a big European grand tour in a few months. We're definitely looking forward to that content.
Oh, yeah. Is it too early to bug him about it? Laughs. Hope he sends virtual postcards.
Totally. Okay. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
That's all for this time on Sip and Talk. See you next time.